My first 25 years of farming, I was completely immersed in my system and in my land. That intimate connection with every living thing and seeing all those, the insect, plant, bird, soil, worm interactions, and to feel like I was a part of that, that was the most spiritually whole I have ever been in my life. Of course, our ancestors have done some breeding work on this for us. Humans and plants are actually, we're partners, right? Going way back. And the genetic malleability of plants and the ingenuity and desire of people create this evolutionary partnership that is as beautiful as milkweeds and butterflies. I mean, it's humans and our plants, we are a system, really. We're a co-evolutionary system. I like to say, a cow without its gut bacteria is not a cow, right? And, you know, agricultural plants without agrarians, they don't stand a chance, right? We create the system that they can live in, and they provide us with the security, the energy, the nutrition to keep creating that system. So I was in that place every day, all day long. And I was a member of that community. That is what made me what I am as a plant breeder, as a business person. The most fearless breeding that I see being done, pretty much by hippies. Hippies are less constrained than other people. We wanted to break and remake everything and remake it in a way that reflected our values more than what we found. I remade the plants that I bred. You know, sometimes I started with commercial varieties and I crossed them together. Sometimes I crossed hybrids together. Sometimes I would cross an heirloom with an all-American selection winner. So the idea was to use the found materials to create something new. I think that's the whole history of plant breeding, period. But I think that's a hippie attitude. Come on up here. This is a parsley breeding project I've got going here. They start out like this. I started growing quinoa in 1984. I got that quinoa from Abundant Life Seed Foundation. And I was actually growing it for salad greens. I wasn't growing it for the seeds. I was growing it for the leaves. Now, of course, quinoa has come to the United States. People recognize it for its value as a food crop. We're importing all this quinoa from South America, and American farmers like, hey, I want to grow quinoa. That looks like a good thing to do. Well, guess what? There are almost no varieties of South American quinoa that are well adapted to the United States because of latitude differences or altitude differences or rainfall differences. Just by keeping that quinoa alive and then eventually starting to select for the seed head, you know, by the 1990s, I began to select for seed heads and seed colors. And by 2012, when somebody finally cared about quinoa for the Pacific Northwest, I had 4 varieties that yielded seed every year here. I went to this quinoa conference, and there are quinoa researchers from Africa, Denmark, Pakistan, Nepal, Argentina, And I'm sitting there watching these people's presentations. And suddenly I'm looking at a presentation from Malawi, Africa. And this Malawian researcher is talking about trying to introduce quinoa to Malawi, because right now they're a completely maize-dependent diet, and they have all sorts of dietary nutritional issues from just eating corn, having incomplete amino acid balances. So he's trying to get people to eat quinoa, and he shows a picture of this demonstration garden in a village, and there are my varieties with big signs written in English this tall. My variety names are printed on the street right in the center of this village. And here's Brightest Brilliant, here's Cherry Vanilla, here's Redhead. And I had no idea that my varieties of quinoa were being grown as part of this guy's research. And it just, I almost cried. I was amazed, and they were beautiful. You know about my lettuce in space, don't you? It was red lettuce. That's what they wanted. They wanted the anthocyanin, you know? Cracks me up. Lettuce in space. Believe me, I wasn't breeding for space. So anyway, those are our F2s. These are oak leaf crossed to romaine. See, they've got some crazy traits. And all these that have a blue marker on them, I'll be saving all that seed in one envelope. All that in one envelope, all that in an envelope. But before I do that, I go around and I take just a few from every plant and put it in to save the whole thing. And then I will also, plants that are about the same height and flowering at about the same time, and they look about the same, I will collect those in one lot and put them, you know, clean them together. Then other plants like these will be later, or even this one is later than this one, right? So I wouldn't put this in the same container, or I wouldn't put this in the same container as this, because this is obviously a different plant. It's making seed later. So I can't tell you how many times though, people who look very straight-laced and buttoned down will come up to me after I've given a presentation about plant breeding in your garden, something that says, you too can do this. They will come up and they'll say, well, aren't you worried about what might happen when you cross two plants together? I say, no, I don't worry about that at all. Well, how do you know what's going to happen? I don't know what's going to happen. Is that legal? Yes, it's perfectly legal. And nobody's going to get hurt. So hippies like to play. They like to turn everyday work into play whenever possible. In terms of my goals when I'm breeding, sometimes I have specific goals. I keep pursuing them. And sometimes I don't get any closer to them. But along the way, I find things I was not looking for. And they're like, oh, that's good. The reason heirlooms are not enough is because the world is changing all the time. Diseases, fungal diseases, insect preferences, viruses, they're changing all the time. And the natural world is changing all the time also. The reason that the natural world isn't always sick and dying all around us is because it's in a coevolutionary dance with all the pathogens. And everything must keep changing. The trees, in order not to be overcome by funguses and insects, they need to keep evolving constantly. Yesterday's oak tree is probably not next century's oak tree. They're going to change some. And so the idea that an heirloom vegetable was good 100 years ago, it must still be good today, well, it may be good in terms of flavor and culinary properties and all sorts of properties like that that we can appreciate culturally. But what about all the funguses that have been evolving? I mean, if that thing has the genetic defenses that it needed 100 years ago, those may not be the same genetic defenses that it needs today, because all of its pests and viruses and everything else are moving along. So that's why I think that actually heirlooms were not meant to be frozen in time. They're meant to be constantly reselected on an ongoing basis. So that is to say, not changed in their flavor, not changed in their seasonality, not changed in their appearance, but changed in their response to pathogens and stress and climate and temperature. Anyone who spends their days working with plants, like a farmer or a gardener, they would understand plant breeding as soon as it happened to them, like it happened to me. Plant breeding just accidentally occurred. You know, I was only 3 years into my farming career, but even at that young stage, the potential of it was so apparent. A new mushroom. But he was the only plant breeder that I knew or knew of until 1998, probably. To hear Mushroom talk about all the things that they had done in southern Oregon, in their garden there, they had crossed fruits, you know, they'd crossed peaches and plums and crossed plums and apricots and all these different things that they had done, and they were hippies. And they were just hippies. And that told me, it's like, wow, yeah, okay, I can do this. I can understand this. And so to hear him speaking, it was sort of like, I don't know, 15 years later, I would read Raoul Robinson's book. And it was the same kind of thing. It's an affirmation. It's like, yeah, your intuition is correct. Further, Mushroom was rapping about, you know, the genetic interconnectedness of all of our crops, and how things as seemingly unconnected as fennel and basil, they actually do share genes, even though they're not in the same family. And this idea that, you know, that across families there are these genetic relationships. I hadn't really thought about any of that, you know, and I hadn't thought about what all the potential would be in crossing zucchinis and pumpkins, and, you know, who knows what can happen. Organic growers need organic seeds. Organic growers should have seeds that are bred in systems that don't use chemicals to protect the crops. You can't really breed for organics if you're spraying fungicide on the crops. That doesn't make any sense. So organic growers, they need seed that is adapted to locations that are not ideal, to mountain locations, to wet locations, to hot and dry locations. So as I'm plant breeding, you know, I'm conscious that I am developing essentially it's going to help somebody farm. It's not a tool because it's a living thing, but it's a component of farming that's essential. There is nothing that makes anyone feel more helpless than to stand in front of a prepared piece of ground. It's got all the fertility, you got the water, it's all tilled, but you don't have any seeds. You have no seeds, you have nothing. So seeds are primary. But the other thing is the seeds that I grow, they reflect my values. And my values are for decentralization, for individual opportunity, for self-reliance, for independence of people from an overbearing economic system. And I want to give people plants that they can grow themselves if they like. I like to provide them with plants that have variation in them so they can actually select the right plant for their location, and then they could continue to grow their own seeds. I like to provide seeds that offer people more independence in life. It's a profound act of discovery to cross-pollinate plants and see the beautiful diversity that comes out of it, and just begin to imagine the usefulness of the diversity that presents itself.